Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. 17 states and the District of Columbia sued President Donald Trump's administration to block new visa rules that would deport international college students if classes were online. Being away from home, pursuing education abroad during a pandemic is already a very stressful situation. But this move by the Trump administration makes things much more precarious. Let's take a closer look at this developing story. Joining us for this today is Professor Charles Kuck, who has been a professor of law at Emory University and the University of Georgia for the last 18 years. He joins us from Atlanta. Also joining us is Dr. Mark Meirowitz, a professor at State University of New York Maritime and also a political analyst. He joins us from New Jersey. And also with us today is Dr. Christopher Marsicano, who is an assistant professor of the practice of higher education at Davidson College and the founding director of the College Crisis Initiative, which tracks college and university responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. He joins us from North Carolina. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Charles Kuck, I'd like to begin with you. Now, just break it down for us. These new visa rules, which categories does it exactly impact? And does it impact all international students in the United States at this moment?
Well, this new rule would impact both students physically in the United States and those who intended to come to the United States in August or September to start university or college in the fall. The rules were written based upon a regulation that has existed for almost 20 years, but which has rarely been used and was written at a time when online classes were rather unique and that are different, and certainly not like they are today. What makes this new change that immigration says they're going to publish difficult is that in the spring, they had allowed students to go online for the rest of the semester to finish their school year. And now only a few weeks before school is to start, when individuals are wanting to come to the U.S. or remain in the U.S. for fall classes, and when many colleges and universities are still do not know how they will run their fall classes, has now put a big problem, big stumbling block in the way of these students, with many of them thinking they will be forced to leave the United States. It is actually part of a greater plan by the Trump administration to limit immigration to the United States. So it's not a surprise they came out with this. I think the surprise is the visceral reaction by universities, colleges, states, and students, as well as the general public, to what seems to be a really poorly designed policy idea.
Definitely, it does seem there is a very, very loud, astounding reaction by so many university campuses, by so many members of the community, and we're going to get to that. But before that, I want to talk to Dr. Mark Meirowitz about exactly how this will impact educational institutions if they have a loss of their international students.
As other professors stated, is not just on some students, international students still remain in the United States. Others will be in foreign countries. You're basically forcing all international students to leave. And what the lawsuit, I think the lawsuit is very persuasive, because what it says is that the president's emergency order is still in effect. And we just heard about the temporary order in the spring, which stated so long as the emergency order is in effect, these students are permitted to take online courses. Well, look, we're in the middle of a COVID. So, you know, what we have here is not just arbitrary and capricious behavior. I took administrative law in law school, I'm a lawyer, and the truth of the matter is that this isn't arbitrary and capricious. This is absolutely insane. It doesn't even pass any test of the law. It's going to be a hypothetical in law schools from going on of government overreach to try to pass a rule against, and I have to say one thing if I may, this is Harvard and MIT. Okay,
right.
I mean, let's just realize this is the gold star of education, the most powerful institutions in the country. And I assure you that the court, the federal court, is going to grant a stop to this today, and it will be nationwide. So the impact is devastating on the colleges. And by the way, one thing was interesting that was brought out in the Harvard lawsuit. What they say is that their connections to the foreign countries and foreign students means there are many foreign institutions and donors who are helping Harvard and MIT and other institutions stay alive during the pandemic. So anyway, devastating, and they're going to win in court today.
Right. Dr. Meirowitz, as you state, the impact is going to be devastating. So many universities and those that set a gold standard, Ivy Leagues here, Harvard, MIT, they are pushing back against this. Dr. Christopher Marsicano, when we talk about how this is being done to strong-arm universities and educational institutions to open up, this is being seen as a way to coerce them into doing this. How are these institutions coping with the ongoing situation? I mean, and I'm not just talking about what has happened right now, but I'm talking about the turbulence that has come with the Trump administration and their constantly changing stance on how to deal with this pandemic.
I think colleges and universities are very inflexible institutions generally. You have a model of education that's been around for over 1,000 years, and the Trump administration has made it so those institutions have to be nimble. So it's not a surprise to many institutions that something like this could happen. And many institutions have been ready to fight this, as we saw Harvard and MIT filed that lawsuit just days after the initial announcement. I do think it is also important to note how institutions are coping with COVID-19 in general. That we have at the College Crisis Initiative collected data on around 3,000 colleges and universities across the United States. And this model of pushing for international students who don't, to not have their visas if they take online only classes is going to affect around 30% to 40% of institutions that were planning on providing primarily online courses or wholly online courses, such as the Cal State system. These institutions often rely on international students, not just for revenue, tuition and fee revenue, but also to make their classrooms much more rich and diverse and to provide new ideas in the classroom. And so this is, I'm glad to hear that Dr. Meirowitz thinks that that this is going to, that the injunction will stand because it would be devastating to colleges and universities.
Dr. Let's go through those numbers because I think numbers often create an alarm, unlike other facts. How much revenue do international students bring to the United States?
Hard to say specifically because in the United States, we have a system of tuition discounting, whereby institutions have a sticker price, but they don't necessarily charge that sticker price for each individual student, providing each individual student based on their means some sort of discount. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to all international students, so it's hard to come up with a specific number, but I will say many institutions rely heavily on international student revenue.
Right, and now according to the U.S. Department of Commerce, international students contributed $44.7 billion to the U.S. economy in 2018 alone. Professor Charles Kuck, when we talk about this and we talk about students coming to the United States, paying so much tuition fees, we know for international students that amount is much, much higher. And the question comes about, with the frustration that we're seeing, just a very, very simple question, how is this happening? And I know you touched upon that just a little bit earlier, but could you just dig deeper into that?
Well, the reason this is happening is really quite simple. The Trump administration does not want legal immigrants in the United States. And they can't get Congress to make a change in the law to limit legal immigration. And so they have been trying to go through administrative processes, like shutting down our consulates when they don't need to be shut down, like issuing immigration proclamations based upon a COVID problem, national security problem, and limiting legal immigration. So this is really part of a bigger, broader plan by this administration to be in the death throes of its existence. And so before January comes around, and when all of these policies will be reversed, they're literally throwing every bad anti-immigration idea they can against the wall to see what sticks. Professor is right. This student visa policy is going to be enjoined by the courts. The $40 billion a year that foreign students will bring to the United States will continue to be able to come in. But the bigger fear for a lot of us is that this is sending a message to the world that America is not the place that President Reagan once called the city on a hill. When we have people like Trump and Stephen Miller in the White House that are seeking ways to stop legal immigration, when the reality is the lifeblood of America, what keeps us strong as a country, which makes us exactly who we are, are immigrants and immigration. I think one day we will look back on this as we sweep it into the dustbin of history. I can't believe we were that stupid to elect somebody that put into power people that would limit immigration to this great country. At the end of the day, we are all immigrants here in America from all over the world, and it's the strength that we carry and bring forth to the rest of the world. So let's not be mistaken. This is currently a policy. It's going to be enjoined, and the fight will continue.
Professor Charles Kuck, I hear what you say, and I want to take this to Dr. Mark Meirowitz. As the professor stated, when you look back at this moment, you will wonder, how did America elect someone like Trump? But when he talks, he is, of course, trying to appease his own voter base. And this speaks to them that we are stopping international students from coming in, taking away the rights of local citizens, of creating a community which is finding it more and more difficult to cope with this scenario. Now, you as a political analyst, how do you think that this has translated to his voter base? Do you think that they are seeing how ridiculous everything is?
Well, I wanted to emphasize one point. It relates to your question and Professor Kuck's very, very interesting comment about immigration. I think this one, yes, it appeals to the base because his base is anti-immigrant. But this one, I think, is about the schools and the whole approach of the administration to COVID. To show that the president says the schools have to reopen because this is not really a threat, and that there's testing, and the testing is causing the numbers to go up. That's the argument. Now, his base does agree with that as well. But this one is a validation of that idea. And by the way, one other thing that's brought out in the Harvard lawsuit, which is very interesting, that I don't think people are thinking about, well, the idea is, well, these foreign students can go back to their own countries and then they can log in on their computers and take the courses. But the case says that in a number of countries, they mentioned Syria, Ethiopia, and others, internet access, and I would say China as well, if I may say, where there are limitations on the internet in other countries, these students, when they go back home, allegedly, according to ICE, will not be able to take the courses and will not be able to continue their education. This is a classic case of government overreach, but I believe it's the court will see through the legality of it and see it as a political measure to back up the president's policy. Now, about the point about this dustbin of history and all that, I have to say this. The American people elected Donald Trump, and it's very possible they may re-elect him in November, and that is the judgment of the people. Our Constitution of the United States says we the people. Sometimes the people make decisions that may not be optimal, but we leave it to the people. We let the jury be people. We let people decide things. We let people go vote, and we let people vote for the president. So I think that the key is the rule of law, and we saw this in the cases on the Trump tax returns, that there's still
Dr.
a rule
Mark
of law,
Meirowitz, sorry to interject here, but since we're short on time, I just want a very, very quick question to you. Now, when we talk about the people electing Donald Trump, of course, that's right, but when institutions are seeing how this is impacting them, how deeply this is impacting them, what kind of role do you think educational institutions can take in at least educating the wider community about the repercussions of these anti-immigration laws?
I think very little, because the Trump base is not going to listen to Harvard and MIT and couldn't care less what the ivory tower says. As the professor said, the city on a hill comes from Massachusetts, and that's sort of looked at as the elite in New England, and the base people of Trump do not listen to that. They listen to these other messages that the president keeps on promoting. If that message continues, and I may add, if the economy actually survives this COVID pandemic, it is possible that President Trump could be reelected. I know, look, nobody thought in 2016 that President Trump would be elected. That was a shocker. Everybody woke up in the morning and was shocked. Well, the Electoral College, everybody, that's the decision. So all I'm trying to say is that the base out there will resonate to open the schools and go to the beaches and open the offices and the anti-immigration point. All of those combined is a perfect storm to help Trump get in the White House, I think. So I think all these points are why they did this.
Right. Dr. Marsicano, now when we've been talking about and hoping that this order will be stopped, these new rules will be stopped, But let's move forward and talk about what the game plan actually is to move forward in the coming terms, especially when we talk about international students and them not knowing whether they should come to the United States at this point in time, even if they can, whether they should or not, given the circumstances, given whether or not classes will be online. What more do we know about that?
So we know that a number of different colleges and universities are implementing what we call a hybrid model, whereby students can take a small number of courses online and a small number of courses in person. Colleges and universities are really pushing that model as an answer for students who are concerned about keeping their visas. I do want to point out, I wanted to lend credence to Professor Meirowitz's argument about online education in general. You know, it's not just a matter of quality of internet. We have parts of the United States that have horrible quality internet. It's a matter also of time zones. If I'm supposed to be teaching synchronously in classes and I have students in China or India or Pakistan, then the time difference does make synchronous instruction and building that community in the classroom very difficult. I think it is the preference of many colleges and universities to make sure that there are in-person options so that students can avail themselves of those options and maintain their visas.
Right, and hearing so many come out of students who have been saying that they come from very varying contexts to what the United States has right now. There was a student who talked about coming from Indian-occupied Kashmir and how going back would not even allow her to continue her education because there is a lockdown, there is no internet. All those measures, it seems like there is a complete lack of empathy and vision. But how do you think that if this goes through, God forbid, how will this impact the future scenario when it comes to students wanting to come to the United States? Is that a possibility, or are speculations regarding what will happen in the future being floated around?
I do think that if I were an international student recruiter in Canada or Australia or the United Kingdom right now, I would first be appalled at this decision and then a little bit excited, because that does provide those countries and institutions in those countries a bit of a competitive advantage for the greatest and most brilliant talent in the world. I will say, however, that colleges and universities are pretty innovative. They can come up with good ideas when they need to. And I expect colleges and universities to find ways to ensure that international student populations can stay on campus, whether it's a class specifically for international students or whether it is a hybrid course structure that allows international students to live and learn in the communities that is the college campus community in the United States. Institutions will find a way. That where there's a will, there's a way. And there's a huge will here, because I cannot stress this enough to viewers and students who are considering coming to the United States. We want you here. We want you in our classrooms. Will you provide a much richer experience for our students? And as I hope our students, domestic students, would provide a much more rich experience for you. And so we will fight tooth and nail, whether it's through lobbying efforts, whether it's through trials and the courts, to make sure that international students can come into our classrooms in the United States.
Right. On that point, Professor Charles, one last question from you now. This isn't just pertaining to students who are studying right now. It's also about their future careers and them hoping that they can pay off debts, they can continue with a chance of trying to build a career in the United States. What does that situation look like at this moment? And if Trump gets reelected for a second term, what will that look? What do you feel like will happen?
Well, let's answer the first question. Right now, if somebody is in the United States and is they can change status to a work visa like an H-1B here in the United States if they are available and they win the H-1B lottery. But for somebody who is outside the United States, they are currently barred from processing an H-1B work visa based on their degree they achieved in the United States. Again, this is intentional. This is designed to limit legal immigration under the guise of protecting American workers, without acknowledging the basic fact that 40% of the public companies in Silicon Valley were founded by former foreign students. So it's kind of like cutting off your nose to spite your face. Looking forward, if Trump is reelected, I think we can see that we will have extraordinarily limited legal immigration and a lot of federal court litigation actions against the administration for violating the current law. At the end of the day, we have a very complicated and well-balanced immigration system. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's well balanced. The president is trying to tip that balance, and we're going to be relying on the courts, especially if he's reelected, to bring that system back into balance. There's dozens of lawsuits currently pending over the proclamation. More are being filed today over the proclamation. For example, we're filing one today on the lottery. People are being barred from coming in who won the lottery this last year for the diversity lottery. The reality is, end of the day, I don't think Americans are that dumb twice. And I have great faith in the American voting public. I think we're going to have a change here in January.
Right. We're going to wait and see what happens in that case. Thank you so much, Professor Charles Kuck, for joining us from Atlanta, Dr. Mark Meirowitz for joining us from New Jersey, Dr. Christopher Marsicano for joining us from North Carolina. We're going to go for a short break. When we come back, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us. Welcome back. It has been 25 years since the slaughter of men and boys in the eastern Bosnian town of Srebrenica, and every year more bodies are found, reiterating the brutality of the genocide. On today's show, we take a look back at history and see how this crime against humanity has impacted the Bosnian community and the collective memories of Europeans. Joining us for this discussion, Mr. Robert J. Donia, who has taught several courses on human rights as a visiting professor at the University of Michigan and is also the author of 3 books, which include Bosnia and Herzegovina in the Second World War and Bosnia and Herzegovina, a Tradition Betrayed. He joins us from California. Thank you so much, Mr. Donia, for taking out the time and talking to us. Now, when we talk about 25 years passing since this genocide, it's important to remember how brutal and how extensive the brutality was in fact. Take us through those events.
It was indeed a long and brutal period, which all circled around the conquest of the isolated city of Srebrenica by the troops of the Bosnian Serbs. And the conquest itself actually went off without a great deal of violence against civilians. But then after it was over, starting on about the 11th of July, then began the slaughter of civilians, very systematic and very violent series of killings in a number of different places around the Srebrenica area. Of course, those bodies were buried in the immediate region of Sarajevo. And then, actually, including after the war, many of them were dug up and reburied in secondary and tertiary sites, which is those are the bodies that are being found each year now in smaller numbers and actually buried in the large cemetery there at Podachari.
Right. Donia, now 25 years on, what lessons have been learned?
Well, I would like to be able to say that a great deal has been learned, and unfortunately, I really can't. I very much regret that although these events are commemorated by world leaders and tens of thousands of people who gather at the site, that you really can't see much of an impact that this has had on the, let's say, general international disposition toward genocide. The other factor that should have had an impact, I think, on things was the good number of trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, in which a number of the Bosnian Serb senior officers and civilian leaders were convicted of genocide. But that has really, I don't see, had very much of an impact on, let's say, international consciousness and attitudes toward genocide.
And if I want to get to the international, as you say, the impact on international consciousness, but when we talk about how this has impacted Europe's consciousness, and especially when we link it to what we see today, which is the rise in xenophobia, rise in Islamophobia. How do you see that? Are you fearful of what you're seeing today?
Certainly. It's a scary scenario internationally, globally, with the rise of, as you say, Islamophobia, also the rise of authoritarian populist regimes, including in the United States and several large countries of Latin America, Europe, and of course, Asia. So it is indeed alarming to see, let's say, the confluence, the convergence of these phenomena in regimes that have been kind of allying with one another recently, and very possibly setting the stage for further genocides or violent acts in that category. That's what's most alarming to me. And the other thing that's alarming is the absence of an effective international effort to combat the rise of those regimes.
Right. And earlier on this week, we were discussing on the show about genocide, and that we have a legal definition for it, an internationally recognized definition. But the mechanisms to, in fact, enforce any sort of punitive measures or any sort of regulation are completely missing. We understand where we've gone wrong in that, but do you see a hope in the future that those international mechanisms will, in fact, become powerful enough to take the necessary action?
Yes, I think that's exactly the problem. The lack of will or consensus on effective measures that might deter or even interrupt a genocide that in the making. And I think that a part of this is the, I believe we have, as an international community, relied too heavily upon law and the idea that we will ever develop an effective enforcement mechanism. And we haven't done enough, on the other hand, to really try to change attitudes on a mass scale so that genocide really becomes the reprehensible thing that it is in the minds of literally billions of people. That's my own feeling about the effort. Is it certainly is not. It's a wonderful ideal to believe that law and the implementation of law will arrest genocides or prevent them. But I think that we really rely on that too heavily and ought to be looking at more different ways to influence the course of events away from genocidal activities.
What solutions do you think are plausible in this situation? I mean, when we look at what's happening, for instance, in Kashmir, where a valley of 8 million people have been put in lockdown, there are new laws which are, in fact, pointed towards demographic changes in the region, very much aligned with what genocide means, massive killings. And still there isn't any intervention. And as you say, it might be in the problem of heavily relying too much on law. But what are the other choices available?
Well, of course, law ideally would be a fundamental part of that solution. But I think that there is perhaps the best hope is in strengthening international organizations, not necessarily the global organizations, but regional bodies like NATO, like the African Union, like ASEAN, that they're manageable in size if they were given proper support and could gather enough support from the countries from their member countries, probably would be in a better position to deter or halt genocides that were underway than the larger global international organizations.
Right.
And I don't see a whole lot of effort trying to sort of think through what that would look like on the part of the international community. There's always this sort of pipe dream of a huge international intervention force, which would involve broad participation of all the great powers. And that is just simply not in the cards as long as the powers that be currently in control of the Security Council. So I think that it really would be worthwhile exploring what was called regional arrangements and alliances in the United Nations declarations, Security Council declarations of the time of Srebrenica, as a possible way to respond quickly to emerging genocidal threats and stir them.
Right. Mr. Donia, just last question. Now, when we talk about what can happen to prevent genocides, as you're mentioning, there needs to be an exploration of other avenues, but also looking back at the genocides that have happened and acknowledging that they were in fact genocides. I mean, even in this Bosnian massacre, in this genocide, there are so many deniers still who exist. How important is that, interpreting history for what it is, understanding and acknowledging genocide for what it was?
It's the phenomenon of genocidal denial. Just really, no one, I think, 5 years ago would have believed that this movement would become as strong as it has. But I think that the key to defeating genocide denial lies in fact, a massive effort on the part of scholars, particularly historians, who will come forth with irrefutable evidence about what took place in Srebrenica and other places. And I point to World War II and the way in which this genocide deniers actually were brought to court in several cases. And the evidence sort of weighed by in this case I'm thinking of the David, the trial, the evidence weighed by a single judge. But I think this has to be a process of well-grounded, evidentially based persuasion that has to be brought out on a large scale, including informational campaigns and so on, to defeat the genocide deniers. I'm not particularly a fan of the approach of arresting those people, putting them in jail, and believing that will force
Mr. Donia, but with
regain.
every narrative that in favor of trying to prove, in fact, what happened in history, won't there be 10 others that will go against that narrative?
And there will always be that discussion. That's why it's important to have it and to, let's say, those of us who are, aware of the fact that this really is a genocide and that there's all sorts of evidence that it's there, is to bring it out. It's not a one-time battle. It's going to be a struggle for decades, maybe longer to come. But I again cite the case of World War II to say I think it can be, if not won, at least become the prevailing narrative in public view.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Robert J. Donia, for joining us from California. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.